If you know me, you know I'm a huge fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm rarely critical of this show, not because I think it's perfect, but because I think Avatar is one of those rare pieces of media that manages to communicate complicated moral ideas without requiring you to agree with a particular political ideology. And that's why I've been thinking about a question that came up when I read an essay and accompanying video about the show that I will link in the description. The main question of both is Avatar: The Last Airbender anti-imperialist? The short answer is yes, but I will make the caveat that anti-imperialism is an incomplete description and misses the point of what Avatar is actually trying to teach us. Imperialism generally refers to a state extending its power or influence over other peoples or territories, often through political, economic, or military domination. Colonialism is a related term, but more specifically involves the establishment and maintenance of control over another territory and its population. These aren't exclusively American or even European phenomena. European colonialism is obviously one major historical example, but imperialism has existed in many different forms and throughout many different periods of history. But what is anti-imperialism? And is Avatar teaching it like the essay says? Anti-imperialism is, broadly defined, as opposition to imperialism. The Fire Nation clearly functions as an imperial power. It invades other nations, it occupies foreign territory, it imposes its political and cultural power, and it attempts to eliminate the air nomads, which Aang is the lone survivor of. So yes, Avatar contains a very obvious critique of imperialism. But the Fire Nation is, in many ways, almost comically obvious as the villain. The show wants children to understand that aggressive conquest is bad. The Fire Nation invades the Earth Kingdom. The air nomads are massacred. Zuko is sent to capture the Avatar. The Fire Nation attempts to remake the world according to its own political order.
We should share this prosperity with the rest of the world. In our hands is the most successful empire in history. It's time we expanded it.
This is not a morally ambiguous situation. The show isn't asking, was the genocide of the air nomads actually a reasonable policy? Obviously not. Instead, the interesting moral questions emerge once we stop looking at the Fire Nation and start looking at everyone's response. Because the show repeatedly asks the audience a much more difficult question. How should you respond to evil? Jet's story is a great example of how the anti-imperialist framework by itself is insufficient in analyzing Avatar. Jet has suffered enormously because of the Fire Nation. His parents were killed, and his village was destroyed. He has every reason to hate the Fire Nation. He eventually reaches the point where he is willing to destroy an entire Fire Nation village because he believes the inhabitants are complicit in the occupation. His trauma has produced an understandable hatred. But understandable hatred does not automatically produce moral behavior. Jet is an especially interesting character because he represents something that the show could have very easily endorsed. He is fighting the oppressor. He is fighting for his people. He has suffered, and he wants justice. But then we see what happens when the desire becomes indistinguishable from revenge. Jet treats an entire population as morally responsible for the actions of their government. Jet's response to the question of how do you respond to evil is to justify increasingly extreme violence as necessary to defeat the enemy. And that's where the moral distinction becomes important. Justice is not the same thing as revenge. The show doesn't deny that injustice needs to be confronted, but it asks whether our response to injustice can itself become unjust.
No, Jet. You became the traitor when you stopped protecting innocent people.
Katara is another example of the show answering the question, how do you respond to evil? Katara, while on a mission with Zuko, ultimately finds the man, Yan-Ra, who killed her mother. This is the person responsible for one of the greatest tragedies of her life. And she has the desire and opportunity to kill him. At seemingly the last moment, Katara chooses to spare his life. It doesn't mean that she forgave him, or that what he did was acceptable. But I think the show is telling us that she refused to let his actions determine who she became.
The monks used to say that revenge is like a two-headed rat viper. While you watch your enemy go down, you're being poisoned yourself.
Then we get to the most important example, Aang's response to Fire Lord Ozai. Aang is faced with what seems like an impossible problem. Ozai is responsible for enormous suffering. If Aang doesn't stop him, Ozai will continue the war by harnessing the power of the comet. And yet, Aang struggles with what he should do. He talks to his past lives. He looks for an answer. All the while rejecting the idea that killing Ozai is necessary. He isn't merely trying to defeat Ozai. He's trying to defeat Ozai without becoming Ozai. This is important because Aang isn't simply being pacifistic. He's not saying nothing should ever be done to evil people.
This isn't a joke, Sokka! None of you understands the position I'm in!
Aang, we do understand. It's just...
Just what, Katara? What?
We're trying to help!
Then when you figure out a way for me to beat the Fire Lord without taking his life, I'd love to hear it!
This is where the show's moral philosophy becomes especially clear. Aang is torn between his duty to save the world as the Avatar and his refusal to kill Ozai. Ideally, he wants to confront the evil that is Ozai without compromising his moral integrity.
I offer you this wisdom, Aang. Only justice will bring peace.
I knew I shouldn't have asked Kyoshi.
Aang knows his responsibility as the Avatar is to restore balance. But how should he interpret justice here? And does that involve killing someone? As we can see, Aang isn't satisfied with Kyoshi's response. The idea that only justice will bring peace sounds reasonable. But what does justice mean? If justice means you hurt me, so I hurt you, then we have a problem. There's an old idea famously associated with Gandhi. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. The show absolutely believes that injustice must be confronted, but it also repeatedly warns us about what happens when justice becomes indistinguishable from retaliation. Because if our definition of justice is reciprocal, the cycle never ends. One act of violence produces another. One generation inherits the hatred of the previous. The Fire Nation's aggression produces resistance. Resistance produces retaliation. Retaliation produces more hatred. And eventually, everyone has a story explaining why their violence is justified.
You think you're the first person to believe their war was justified? Countless others before you have come here, seeking weapons or weaknesses or battle strategies.
Ultimately, Aang stops Ozai by using energy bending thanks to the knowledge gained from the lion turtle. Aang breaks the cycle and doesn't violate his morals in the process. The essay and video approach Avatar through a Marxist and critical pedagogical lens. That framework can be used to analyze Avatar. My disagreement specifically is that the critical pedagogical framework isn't a complete explanation of what Avatar is teaching. Marxism as an intellectual tradition originates with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and focuses on class conflict, material conditions, capitalism, and the relationship between economic structures and political power. Paulo Freire's idea of critical pedagogy applies critical theory to education. Critical pedagogy is broadly concerned with education as a process through which people become aware of social, political, and economic structures and learn to critically examine them. Instead of education simply transferring information from teacher to student, critical pedagogy encourages students to question the world around them. For example, as Leibovich points out, Aang enters the Fire Nation school and challenges its propaganda, which resembles Freire's problem-posing pedagogy.
Question 1. What year did Fire Lord Sozin battle the Air Nation army? Kuzan?
Is that a trick question? The air nomads didn't have a formal military. Sozin defeated them by ambush.
Well, I don't know how you could possibly know more than our national history book, unless you were there 100 years ago.
I'll just write down my best guess.
The show teaches its audience to question propaganda and authority, and I think it's worth noting that questioning authority isn't the same thing as adopting a particular political ideology. If Avatar teaches us to question authority, then we shouldn't exempt our own political interpretations of Avatar from that same scrutiny. Regardless, the show provides real political problems to think about: war, propaganda, sexism, imperialism, violence, justice. In that sense, Avatar is doing something remarkable. It's bringing political philosophy into children's entertainment. The show asks us to recognize oppression, question authority, and understand how political systems affect individuals. and it even repeatedly asks its audience, via its characters, the even more difficult question, how should you respond to evil?
Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history, and somehow, the war was our way of sharing our greatness with the rest of the world. What an amazing lie that was. The people of the world are terrified by the Fire Nation. They don't see our greatness. They hate us.
In the essay, Lyubovitch extensively compares the Fire Nation to the United States of America. Personally, I don't think a one-to-one comparison is useful. I'm not saying that the USA can't be imperialistic, but I think that Avatar is critical of any nation that has imperialist tendencies. The USA has engaged in imperialistic and colonial practices, but it has also produced liberal institutions, concepts like freedom of speech, and the creation of a constitutional republic, not to mention the creation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Obviously, the USA isn't perfect, but recognizing the flaws in your country doesn't require believing that your country is completely evil. The United States can have genuinely admirable accomplishments while also committing serious injustices. Therefore, I would argue that the Fire Nation is not a one-to-one metaphor for the United States. It is rather a metaphor for any nation or country that engages in imperialistic practices. This allows us to analyze the show in its historical context, without forcing a country into a simple good versus evil binary.
Do you like destroying towns? Do you like destroying families? Do you?
Oh, please, let me go. Have mercy.
Does the Fire Nation let people go? Does the Fire Nation have mercy?
The show clearly does not fit into the binary of the Fire Nation being the oppressor and everyone else is the oppressed. But where does that leave us, and what is the moral of Avatar? If the question, how should we respond to evil, is any guide, I think restraint and balance are closer to the moral center of the show than anti-imperialism alone. Anti-imperialism explains what Aang is fighting against. Restraint helps explain how he chooses to fight. Anti-imperialism doesn't tell Katara what to do with the man who killed her mother. It tells us that she has legitimate grievances, but neither of those things actually answers the moral question. Restraint, mercy, and moral integrity do. Aang's decision to not kill Ozai, Katara's decision to not kill Yan-Ra, and Zuko's rejection of his father's ideology are all examples of people breaking cycles. The show isn't saying to never fight. It's saying fight without becoming what you hate. In other words, maintain moral integrity while confronting evil. So, is Avatar: The Last Airbender anti-imperialist? Yes. The Fire Nation is an imperial power, and the show clearly condemns conquest, genocide, occupation, nationalism, and cultural destruction. But if that's where our analysis ends, I think we're missing the point. Avatar isn't merely asking, who is the oppressor? It's asking, how do you respond to evil? The show refuses to tell us that being a victim of suffering makes every subsequent action morally acceptable. Instead, it gives us characters who have to decide what they're going to do with their suffering. And some of them choose revenge, some choose hatred, and some choose mercy. Avatar doesn't deny injustice, it doesn't deny the necessity of fighting, and it doesn't ask us to surrender to the Fire Nation. But Aang refuses to believe that justice requires him to abandon the very principles he's trying to defend. And maybe that's the real lesson of Avatar, to not oversimplify by saying fight imperialism or liberate the oppressed, but rather don't let the evil done to you become the evil you do to someone else. Because if the goal is to create a better world, then the means matter too. If defeating your enemy requires you to become your enemy, then what exactly have you defeated? And maybe that's what it means to shape your own destiny. You can't choose everything that happens to you, but you can choose what you become because of it.
I'll tell you a little secret, young airbender. Just as you reshape those clouds, you have the power to shape your own destiny.